Julie Reed hadn't expected her return home to feel so jarring. After nearly 3 weeks at the rehabilitation center, she had pictured a calm reintegration, a quiet slide back into routine, not this abrasive re-entry into a neighborhood that now felt oddly shifted. Her spine still ached in waves, a dull reminder of the surgery she was lucky to survive, and though she could walk short distances unaided, standing for long, or even bending slightly wrong, triggered a stiffness that locked her joints and stole her breath. The building where she lived, a modest 3-story condo complex tucked into a bland suburban grid, had never felt particularly hostile before. It was mostly retirees, empty nesters, and the occasional quiet bachelor with a strong opinion about hedge height, but not much else. She assumed her time away would go unnoticed, maybe marked by a missed hello in the hallway or a package piling up. Nothing more. Certainly not this. The first thing she noticed was her parking space, or rather, the absence of it. It wasn't that the space itself had vanished. The slab of concrete labeled Unit 2 billion was exactly where it had always been, right outside the lobby door, and clearly marked in faded white paint. What was missing was the metal post, the official blue and white sign with the wheelchair symbol and her unit number that had been installed the morning before her surgery. That sign, after months of back and forth with the building's management and 2 rounds of documentation from her physician, it had finally been authorized just days before her procedure. She remembered the technician from the maintenance company hammering the last bolt into the concrete as she watched from her window, a mix of pride and exhaustion in her chest. It had felt like a small victory, a symbol of dignity, not a luxury, not a favor, but a necessary adjustment to help her preserve some independence in the aftermath of her physical upheaval. Now it was gone. In its place sat a silver Audi Q5 with tinted windows and an Art is Civic bumper sticker, parked with surgical precision, engine still warm. Julie stood in the breezeway for a moment, stunned not at the presence of another car, but at the sudden erosion of something she had fought to secure. She wasn't the confrontational type, nor was she quick to assume malice, but the implications hit hard. Someone had either taken it upon themselves to remove a city-recognized accessibility marker, or had benefited from its absence without hesitation. Either way, the message was the same. What was hers could be taken, and what she needed could be ignored. The building manager's office was already closed when she checked. A dim light inside flickered near the back, but the door was locked and the front desk unmanned. She left a voicemail. Then a second. Her voice, tired and flatter than she wanted, explained that her reserved disability sign was gone and someone else was parked in the space. She ended the second message with a factual but pointed remark. The spot was granted based on medical certification, and its removal without notice could constitute a legal issue. No threats. Just facts. That night she parked on the far side of the lot, taking the only available space along the slope near the loading dock. It took her 3 attempts to exit the vehicle without twisting wrong. The walk to the building's entrance felt longer than usual, the slight incline a fresh test of her recovery. By the time she reached her door, her breath was uneven and her hands shook from the tension she hadn't known she was carrying. It wasn't just the sign. It was the silence around its removal. The lack of notice, the indifference it implied. The next morning, she received a call, not from the building management, but from a woman who introduced herself as Carrie from Residential Aesthetics and Property Services, a third-party contractor the complex apparently used for signage and exterior fixtures. Carrie was upbeat, borderline chipper, as she explained that a temporary cancellation request had come through their system regarding Space 2 billion. According to their records, it had been submitted 2 weeks ago, authenticated via the building's internal portal, and approved by the board. Julie blinked at the phone. Submitted by whom? She asked, voice even. There was a pause. Well, it looks like it came from the user ID associated with your unit, Carrie replied, unfazed. So the assumption was that it came from you. Was that incorrect? Julie closed her eyes for a moment, then reopened them to stare out the window where the Audi remained. "Yes," she said. "That is very incorrect." She requested all documentation associated with the request and was told it would be sent via email shortly. True to her word, Carrie forwarded the digital form, complete with a timestamp and a system-generated signature from an account labeled Julie.R-2B. Julie didn't recognize the email address tied to the entry. It wasn't hers. The form itself looked official, wrapped in corporate language and internal codes, but it was a fake. A polished one. Someone had gone out of their way to simulate a legitimate submission, knowing it would result in the revocation of her designated space. She sat still for a while after reading it through twice, her muscles tightening in that slow, warning way her doctors had taught her to monitor. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a manufactured erasure one made possible by systems that accepted appearances over accountability. The parking sign hadn't simply been misplaced or removed as part of maintenance. It had been intentionally flagged for cancellation with paperwork to back it up. Someone had impersonated her, and no one had thought to verify the source before removing her access. Julie had learned long ago not to waste energy on outrage that wouldn't serve her. She wasn't a crusader. She didn't post on forums or start hashtags. She didn't film altercations on her phone. She worked quietly, persistently, methodically. That was how she got through the process of securing that parking space to begin with. That was how she would get it back. Still, as she stood at her kitchen counter rereading the email, another thought occurred to her, one that she had almost forgotten. A month ago, before leaving for the rehab center, her father had handed her a small black device the size of a thumb drive and said, "If anyone messes with your sign, this'll tell you where it goes." At the time, she'd laughed. He worked in industrial security systems for warehouses and had a drawer full of gadgets that rarely saw practical use. But she had taken it, half-jokingly, and zip-tied it to the back of the parking sign near the bolt plate. She hadn't thought about it since. She powered up the companion app on her phone. It took a few minutes to connect, buffering through weak signals and app permissions, but eventually a blinking red dot lit up on the map. The tracker was active, and it wasn't far. The signal led not to a storage room or maintenance shed, but to a unit at the far end of the building. Unit 3A, Karen Langford's unit. Julie knew her by reputation more than interaction. Karen had been part of the condo board until last year, polite in public, quietly assertive behind closed doors. She ran a private art space off-site that she called an installation lab, and was known for abstract projects using found objects and community-integrated sculpture. Her Audi Q5 had been parked in that same spot 3 days in a row, and now Julie was beginning to understand why. It wasn't coincidence. It was appropriation. The question wasn't just why Karen had taken the sign. The question was, what had she done with it? Julie didn't act on impulse. She never had. Even as a child, her instinct wasn't to react but to calculate, to study, to determine the most rational course of action before moving forward. That quality had served her well in every part of life, from her career in urban planning to her long and complicated recovery after the accident. But this time, something deeper than logic pulled at her, a kind of low, steady burn in her gut that told her this wasn't just a mistake or misunderstanding. It was an encroachment. An intentional one. One that came from a person who didn't see boundaries as something to respect, but as something to manipulate. The blinking red dot on her phone hadn't moved since the previous night. The tracker's signal, discreet, industrial, and reliable, showed the object's location exactly 3 doors down from her own apartment in Unit 3A, behind the closed blinds and potted ficus tree on the second-floor balcony of Karen Langford's condo. Julie stared at the map long enough for the screen to dim, then locked the phone and set it aside. There was no need for confrontation. Not yet. She wasn't about to march down the hall, knock on the door, and demand the return of her property. That wasn't who she was, and more importantly, that wasn't how she won. Instead, she began documenting first the original installation of the sign, which she had photographed weeks ago, purely out of habit. Then the digital receipt of its installation from the property services company. Then the tracker activation log. She compiled it all into a neatly labeled folder on her desktop. She didn't tell anyone what she was doing. Not even the neighbor from the third floor who occasionally walked with her to the mailbox and had once offered to bring her groceries during recovery. This wasn't a social matter. It was a matter of autonomy, and she intended to treat it with the same clinical precision that had carried her through bureaucratic red tape in city planning meetings for years. Later that day, as she moved carefully down the hallway with the aid of her walking stick, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. On the community bulletin board near the mailroom, beneath the usual HOA memos and lost pet notices, was a flyer printed in full color and laminated. Across the top, in bold serif font, were the words, "Reclaiming Space, a Study in Occupied Infrastructure." Below that, in stylized font, was the name Karen Langford. The flyer advertised a private showing, to be held off-site the following weekend at a converted shipping warehouse on the edge of town, an event open only to select guests and patrons of civic art. No contact number, just an RSVP email. Julie blinked at the flyer, her gaze drawn to the photo collage beneath the title. It featured 6 objects, each decontextualized and mounted in stark, gallery-like lighting. A rusted gate hinge, a broken street sign, a section of brick-patterned sidewalk, and in the far right corner, unmistakably cropped but still visible, a disability parking sign, painted over in monochrome tones and partially obscured by a metallic mesh frame. Her sign. She didn't stay to study the flyer further. She turned, retrieved her mail, and returned to her unit, where she sat at the kitchen table and simply stared at her reflection in the glossy screen of her powered-down laptop. The implications were maddening, not just that Karen had taken her property, but that she had recontextualized it, transformed it into a piece of commentary, a symbol of what? Occupation? Ownership? Resistance? The irony was grotesque. Julie didn't need to be an artist to recognize when her experience was being stolen and repackaged as aesthetic rebellion. The next step was not anger. It was formality. Julie contacted the building's managing company again, not with another voicemail, but with a written complaint, filed through both email and the digital portal, detailing the unauthorized removal of her designated sign, the impersonation of her user ID, and the suspected appropriation of property by another resident. She included attachments, images, dates, the tracker log, and a note that local law enforcement would be notified if the matter wasn't resolved within 5 business days. She didn't bluff. She didn't threaten. She simply wrote the truth, carefully and without embellishment, and hit send. To her surprise, the response came quickly less than 2 hours later from a supervisor named Diana, who apologized profusely for the confusion and had claimed that an internal review had revealed irregularities in the request to remove the sign. Diana didn't elaborate, but she promised to investigate further. Julie knew what that meant: delay. There would be meetings, message threads, and risk assessments before anyone would do something concrete. That was the way these systems protected themselves. By evening, the red dot on the tracker had moved. Only slightly, just enough to show that the sign had shifted position inside Karen's unit. That same night, Julie saw her for the first time since returning. Karen exited the stairwell at the far end of the hall, carrying a narrow black canvas bag slung over one shoulder and a to-go coffee in her hand. She paused when she saw Julie at the other end, raised a hand with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and said, "Back already? You're looking great." Julie nodded once, stiffly. "Appreciate it," she replied, and watched as Karen turned and walked briskly toward her unit. No mention of the sign. No apology. Not even a flicker of acknowledgement. It was like watching someone move through a world that refused to admit it shared space with yours. Julie spent the next day gathering the final pieces of her documentation. She contacted the contractor who had installed the original sign and requested a replacement invoice, which he emailed that afternoon. She requested a formal copy of her building's accommodations approval form, which the front office printed for her reluctantly, after reminding her that signage isn't always permanent. She filed an official report with the non-emergency line at the local precinct, marking the incident as a property dispute with potential accessibility interference. Again, she was told it would be filed and reviewed. She didn't expect action, she just needed the record. What she didn't expect was the envelope. It arrived 2 days later, left on her doormat in a plain manila sleeve. No return address, no postage. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper, printed in black and red ink, the kind used for curated gallery materials. At the top was the title, The Assumed Right, a Reclamation of Control. Below that, in block quotes, was a line that made her stomach clench. This installation challenges the performative nature of access and the constructed narrative of need. What happens when we remove symbols of control from their sanctioned positions and place them in spaces of artistic ambiguity? No name was attached, but the intent was clear. Karen was turning the sign into a statement not about Julie, but about control, about property, about who decides what belongs to whom. It was grotesque. And it was calculated. Julie scanned the paper, her hands steady, her thoughts not. She knew this wasn't over. She also knew that if she didn't act soon, the story would shift entirely out of her hands. It would stop being about her access and become about Karen's expression. And once that happened, no amount of logic, evidence, or medical paperwork would matter. Because once something became art, people stopped caring where it came from. They just cared about how it made them feel. And Julie was done being someone else's symbol. The first real shift in tone didn't come from a confrontation. It came from silence, the kind that follows precision. Julie had expected some form of reaction after filing the formal property interference report. She thought perhaps someone from management would show up at her door to clarify details, maybe ask her to soften the language for internal purposes, or at the very least call to verify the nature of her complaint. Instead, what she got was a very clean, very professional notification email stating that the case had been received and escalated to community relations. That term community relations wasn't in any of the documentation she had read when she moved in 2 years ago. It wasn't in the bylaws or in the leasing agreement. It had the feel of a placeholder for problems they didn't know how to or didn't want to confront directly. And it meant only one thing: they weren't going to solve this. They were going to wait for it to expire. What Julie hadn't expected, however, was to receive a second envelope. This time it arrived through the mail slot, folded neatly in half and tucked inside what looked like a reused envelope from an old real estate newsletter. The outside had her unit number written in small, careful letters, but no name. Inside was a printed photo, low resolution, slightly pixelated, of the original parking sign. Only now it had been mounted on a clean white panel, surrounded by steel rods, and painted with a faded gradient of pastel blue and gray. Underneath was a label, Mobility Construct 4, Karen Langford, 2023. There was no note, no explanation, no accusation, just the image, as if to say, this is what it is now. You don't own it anymore. Julie held the picture in her hand and stared at it, trying to parse the layers of meaning that Karen had embedded into this action. It wasn't just an appropriation. It was a rebranding, a redefinition of something that had never belonged to Karen in the first place. She had taken a practical symbol, functional, necessary, and turned it into an idea, removing it from its source while still tying it, invisibly, to Julie's life. What disturbed Julie more than the act itself was the precision of it. Karen hadn't simply taken the sign and used it as decoration. She had absorbed it into her language, her gallery, her discourse. She had treated Julie's access as material to be worked with, twisted, reframed. It wasn't vandalism. It was erasure disguised as commentary. And worse, it was starting to work. That weekend, the tracker's location shifted again. According to the app, the sign had been moved out of Karen's condo and was now located in a commercial building on the industrial outskirts of the city, an old warehouse space that had been converted into studios and event halls. Julie recognized the address from the flyer she'd seen earlier. Karen's exhibit was open, which meant the sign was now on public display. That idea stung deeper than she had anticipated. It wasn't just that her space had been taken, it was that strangers were now walking past her sign, admiring it, interpreting it, maybe even applauding it, without any knowledge of what it meant or where it had come from. In their eyes, it wasn't theft. It was art. And in that shift of perception, Julie's experience had been overwritten. She thought about going to the exhibit, not to confront, but to observe. Yet the very idea of walking into a space that celebrated the object of her exclusion felt grotesque. So she stayed home, tracking the signal, watching it remain stationary inside the venue for hours, then days, as if mocking her restraint. On the third day, the dot began to flicker, brief intervals of movement that indicated relocation, perhaps a reshuffling of the exhibit or a transportation of items. A few hours later, the signal went dark, not lost, disabled. That night, someone knocked on her door. Not loudly, two soft, deliberate taps. Julie rose cautiously, feeling the tug in her back as she reached for her cane. She looked through the peephole and saw nothing at first, then noticed the edge of a folded note sticking out from the bottom of the doorframe. When she opened it, a small piece of gray paper slid to the floor. In the center was a single line of handwritten text. "You're making this bigger than it is. Let it go." There was no signature, no threat, just a statement, a demand to surrender. It was the first moment Julie felt something that wasn't just anger or indignation. It was something heavier, something close to dread. Karen was no longer pretending this was innocent. She had moved past passive acts of appropriation and had begun engaging in direct psychological pressure. She had escalated the situation in a way that allowed her to maintain the appearance of dignity and distance while applying pressure from behind a carefully polished facade. Julie did not call the police. Not yet. Instead, she took the note, photographed it, and filed it with the rest of her growing digital archive. Then she reached out to her attorney, not for litigation, but for advice. Her attorney, Elena, an accessibility law specialist who had helped her through the original accommodation request, was measured and clear. "You're being targeted," she said plainly. "But unless she threatens you directly or causes physical harm, you're going to need a strategic approach. We'll start by issuing a cease and desist, registered, official, and on record. If she violates that, we move to a formal claim." The next day, the letter was delivered. Julie didn't wait to see if Karen received it. She simply resumed her day as if nothing had changed, though she checked the tracker app compulsively, hoping the signal might return. It didn't. Instead, something else arrived. A complaint. Delivered through official channels, the document claimed that Julie had deliberately misused building resources, falsely accused a fellow resident, and engaged in disruptive behavior that negatively impacted community cohesion. It was signed by a member of the community board, someone she had only met once, a tall man with a polished voice and a habit of never looking people in the eye. The complaint didn't reference the sign directly. Instead, it focused on Julie's tone, her rigidity, and her refusal to de-escalate tension. It ended with a recommendation that her parking request be re-reviewed for ongoing necessity. Julie laughed when she read it quietly, bitterly. Not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly on script. This wasn't just about the sign anymore. It was about character, about who got to be seen as reasonable and who got to be seen as disruptive. Karen, with her gallery shows and civic-minded phrases, could absorb public space without question. Julie, with her medical papers and her careful words, was now rigid. It was a familiar playbook. The marginalized person is reframed as aggressive. The aggressor becomes misunderstood. And the audience, as always, chooses whoever smiles better. Still, Julie had no intention of stepping back. She responded to the complaint through proper channels, attaching a scanned copy of her cease and desist letter and referencing the original theft report. She CC'd her attorney. She CC'd the management. She CC'd herself. No emotion. Just documents. Paper doesn't panic. But even as she held the line, she felt something fray at the edges. One evening, while returning from physical therapy, she noticed her mailbox had been pried slightly open. Nothing was missing, but the flap had been bent inwards at an unnatural angle, as if someone had jammed something inside and then changed their mind. The next day, she found that her recycling bin had been knocked over, its contents scattered. Small things. Petty. But precise. Julie didn't log them with the building. She simply added them to her file. She knew how people responded to patterns, not moments. She was building a record. That's how you win. Not with emotion, not with confrontation, but with proof, stacked cleanly and delivered with perfect timing. By the end of the week, her replacement parking sign had still not been installed. The space remained unmarked, unofficial, vulnerable. The Audi continued to occupy it, never there long enough to be sighted, but always present when she needed it most. Karen, as if sensing Julie's silence, seemed to double down. She passed her in the hall with pleasant, sugary greetings. She waved in the elevator. Once she even asked, "How's the back?" Julie simply nodded, returned the courtesy, and said nothing more. But the most telling moment came late one night when Julie returned home from a pharmacy run and found a printed postcard taped to her door. It showed an abstract sculpture of twisted aluminum and weathered wood, draped with reflective tape. In the bottom right corner, in tiny font, were the words "Restraint is relative, KLL." Julie didn't take the card down immediately. She stared at it for a long moment, then slowly peeled it away, folded it in half, and slid it into the same envelope that had once held her warning. She didn't need to respond. The escalation had already occurred. The pressure had shifted. Karen wasn't just claiming space. She was performing dominance, and Julie was no longer simply reacting. She was preparing. Julie had always believed that clarity was a form of power. Ambiguity served people like Karen, people who spoke in riddles and statements layered so deeply in metaphor they could retreat behind meaninglessness whenever the consequences loomed too close. But clarity that was sharp. It cut through euphemism and framed things plainly. This happened. This was mine. This was taken. The days following the cease and desist letter felt thick with tension, not because of any immediate blowback, but because of the space it created. Karen went silent. The Audi vanished from Julie's space. Flyers advertising upcoming exhibits were removed from the building's shared spaces. The hallway, once subtly hostile with passive greetings and smiles that were all teeth, became neutral, sterile, almost respectful in its coldness. It would have been easy to believe it was over, but Julie knew better. The tracker never came back online. The property managers stopped replying to emails. And the maintenance department still hadn't reinstalled her parking sign. It was as if the entire building had agreed to return to a state of before, as if none of it had happened, as if erasure had worked. Karen, no doubt, had gone to ground, folding herself back into the good graces of whatever circle protected her, and whispering about boundaries and miscommunication, and feeling targeted until the narrative returned to balance her balance. It would have been a mistake to interpret the silence as retreat. It wasn't retreat. It was planning. Julie's first confirmation came from an unexpected source. A woman named Dawn, who worked at the front desk during the night shifts and rarely interacted with residents outside of accepting packages or redirecting maintenance calls, caught her in the elevator just before midnight on a Tuesday. The elevator lights flickered briefly as it descended, and Julie leaned against the rail, her muscles aching from a misstep on uneven pavement earlier that day. Dawn didn't make small talk. She simply leaned forward slightly and said, "Just so you know, the gallery event on Saturday, it's a private rental, but it's tied to a donor. If something of yours ends up in it again, you didn't hear it from me." Then she stepped out at the second floor and disappeared down the hallway. Julie didn't react outwardly. She simply absorbed the information and returned to her apartment, where she poured a glass of water and sat in the dark for 20 minutes without moving. The implication was obvious. Karen hadn't stopped. She had paused, and now she was moving her narrative into a new venue, one where Julie's presence would be even less welcome, and her protest even less palatable. It was one thing to call out a neighbor for theft. It was another to disrupt a high-profile arts and dialogue weekend attended by donors and academics and municipal art officials who had no interest in the origin of objects so long as they could be made to say something profound. Julie knew she had a choice. She could do what people expected. She could file another complaint, another report, another notice. She could send Elena to threaten legal action again, or she could try something else. She chose to attend. It took effort. Dressing in something she could comfortably walk in. Calling a rideshare instead of driving, knowing full well that the lot outside the venue wouldn't have accessible parking without a designated permit, and even if it did, the odds of it being respected were slim. She arrived precisely 35 minutes after the start time and walked in with her name unannounced, simply nodding when the volunteer asked if she was on the early invite list. He let her through. No one questioned her. The interior of the gallery was minimalist, whitewashed walls and soft recessed lighting, curated to emphasize absence, shadow, and material texture. Conversations floated in the air, muffled but pretentious, as people pointed at suspended objects and made deliberately meandering observations about presence and displacement. Julie moved slowly, one step at a time, not stopping too long in one place, avoiding eye contact. She didn't want to be seen. She wanted to see. She found it in the back corner of the main room, partially obscured by a metal partition that had been painted to resemble oxidized steel. The sign was no longer blue and white. It had been stripped and covered in a translucent resin that made the original lettering visible only at certain angles. Over it, faint black paint strokes had been applied, words in cursive so diluted they looked like ghosts of sentences. The metal pole had been repurposed into a twisted arc that coiled around the base like a rib. At the bottom, etched into a small bronze plate, was a title, Entitlement in Echo Karen Langford. Julie stood in front of it for a long time. No one approached her. The space around the piece was oddly empty, as if people sensed something unspoken, some charge in the air they couldn't name. A young woman passed by and muttered, "I think it's about mobility narratives, or trauma, or both." Her friend nodded solemnly. "It's about the social contract, I think." Julie felt a strange kind of nausea, not in her stomach, but in her bones. This thing in front of her, this object that had once simply told people this person needs this space, had now been transformed into metaphor, a floating statement untethered from its human function. It wasn't even about her anymore. It was about what Karen could extract from it. The theft wasn't physical. It was interpretive. Julie left without speaking to anyone. She went home and didn't call Elena, didn't write an email, didn't even record what she'd seen. She simply lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, and let the shame settle. Not because she had done something wrong, but because she had allowed herself to believe that clarity alone could prevail. The following morning, she began preparing for the inevitable. She knew what was coming. Publicity, laws, the art community rallying around Karen's brilliance. Perhaps a short article in a civic arts blog praising the raw commentary on institutional signage and its implications. Maybe even a feature in one of the smaller local weeklies. Karen would be elevated. Julie would be erased, but the silence persisted. No articles, no pictures, no mentions, until the email. It arrived under the subject line Urgent Inquiry Accessibility Compliance, sent from a City Arts Commission official whose name Julie didn't recognize. The message was concise, professional, and surprisingly pointed. We received an anonymous tip that an object currently on display in MS. Langford's installation may have been taken from a functional municipal accessibility designation without proper authorization. Can you confirm or deny involvement? in this matter? A response is requested within 72 hours. Julie read the email 3 times before responding. She did not deny. She confirmed politely, with supporting documentation and dates. She included images of the original installation, the tracker log, the correspondence with the contractor, and her initial formal complaint. She signed her name at the bottom and clicked send without a second thought. 3 days later, a second email arrived. Thank you for your cooperation. The piece in question has been voluntarily withdrawn from the exhibition pending review. You will be notified if further action is required. No apologies. No acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Just the mechanical pivot of a bureaucracy trying to avoid liability. Still, it was movement. It was proof that, at least once, someone had listened. Later that week, Julie received a message from Elena. I've been informed through unofficial channels that your complaint triggered an internal audit of the gallery's acquisition processes. Karen's future bookings are currently under reconsideration. Julie didn't celebrate. There was nothing victorious about watching someone finally stumble when they should have been stopped far earlier. But there was a deep, steady satisfaction in knowing that she hadn't disappeared. That her experience had not been entirely cannibalized. That evening, Julie returned to the parking lot. Her space remained unmarked, still bare concrete, still unofficial. But the Audi was gone. The air was quiet. No notes, no cards, no noise. Julie stood there for a moment, then turned back toward the building, her walking stick tapping against the pavement in rhythm with her steps. She didn't look back. For now, that was enough. Julie had believed that the withdrawal of the piece from the exhibition would mark a turning point. She didn't expect an apology, not from Karen, and not from the institution that had allowed her actions to escalate in the first place, but she had assumed naively she would later admit that there would at least be a period of quiet. A lull in the tension where things could stabilize and the most overt forms of antagonism would dissolve under the weight of scrutiny. For a brief moment, she thought the story might finally begin to conclude, not with justice, but with fatigue. And for a week, perhaps 2, it appeared that might actually happen. The parking space remained unmarked, but it was vacant. Julie resumed using it, not with pride but with caution, locking her car with an extra press of the key fob, glancing over her shoulder each time she stepped out, waiting for a signal that Karen had returned to reclaim the territory she no longer had any claim to. There was no word from the management company. Elena hadn't heard anything new. The tracker remained disabled, and the sign, for all practical purposes, had vanished from the world. Then came the petition. It arrived via email first, sent to all residents under the subject line Community Space Optimization Proposal. The language was bland, procedural, padded with appeals to collective responsibility and shared resources. But buried in the third paragraph was the true purpose, a reallocation of underutilized or problematic designations, including but not limited to reserved parking spaces whose occupants have not maintained up-to-date verification of medical necessity. It didn't name Julie. It didn't have to. Everyone knew who the target was. The language was bureaucratic camouflage, designed to appear rational while disguising personal malice as policy. It had the fingerprints of someone practiced in soft power, someone who knew how to weaponize structure. Julie read it twice before forwarding it to Elena, who responded within the hour with a message that simply read, "Don't engage." Yet. But the petition didn't stay digital. Within days, a printed version appeared on the community bulletin board in the lobby, beneath the laminated notices about window washing and quarterly inspections. A pen was attached with tape, and by the end of the first afternoon, 5 signatures had already been added. By the third day, there were 12. None of them were people Julie had ever spoken to directly. A few she didn't even recognize. But there they were, neighbors, most older, some retirees who had lived in the building longer than her, others simply tenants who valued quiet over conflict, or who had seen the exhibit and decided, privately, that they agreed with Karen's worldview more than Julie's inconvenience. The betrayal wasn't surprising. It was the efficiency of it that shocked her. That weekend, Julie found her mailbox open again, this time with a piece of paper folded inside. It wasn't threatening, just a printout of a social media post, screen captured and printed in color. It showed a photo of Karen at a podium, mid-sentence, gesturing with her hands as she spoke. Behind her was a projector slide with the title Owning Public, The Aesthetics of Civic Disobedience. The caption read, "Honored to speak about material activism and the ways communities resist imposed order through reclamation and repurposing. More to come." Julie didn't know who had left the printout, or whether it was meant to intimidate her or simply taunt her. But she took it, folded it again, and slipped it into the folder she kept in the drawer beside her bed. She no longer filed things digitally. Too many systems could be erased. She needed weight paper, things that couldn't be wiped. The following week, she received a formal notification from the building's administration. It wasn't an eviction notice or a fine, just a request: submit new medical documentation verifying ongoing eligibility for a designated accessible parking space. The letter was dated 2 days after the petition had crossed the 20-signature threshold. The timing wasn't coincidental. Someone had coordinated this, had known exactly how far they could push before the structure had to respond. Julie didn't panic. She scheduled an appointment with her doctor, updated the paperwork, and submitted it along with a cover letter signed by Alina. She included the original approval forms and a note referencing the pending investigation by the City Commission. She made no appeals to emotion. No mention of Karen. Just facts, dates, signatures. She played the game the way it was designed to be played, perfectly, professionally, and without any space for misinterpretation. But that wasn't the end. 3 days after she submitted the paperwork, she returned home from an early appointment to find her car blocked in. Not by another vehicle, but by a pair of bright orange construction cones chained together and connected to a temporary no parking pending reallocation. Sign bolted to a freestanding metal stand. It hadn't been there the night before. The sign bore the logo of the management company and a permit number that Julie immediately recognized as fabricated too short, no prefix, no city seal. She took photos, then called the building's security line. The man who answered was polite but clearly underprepared. "We were told to put the cones out," he said. "It came from the main office. Something about space redistribution." Julie asked if he had a work order. He didn't. She asked who had signed off on the request. He didn't know. "Look, if it's a mistake, I can move them," he offered weakly. "But I'm supposed to log any override." "I can call my supervisor." "Do that," Julie said. While she waited, she stood by her car, watching as neighbors passed without speaking. Some glanced in her direction. Others looked away entirely. The silence was sharper than anything Karen could have said. It spoke of complicity, of comfort in other people's discomfort, of an unwillingness to challenge anything that didn't affect them personally. The cones were eventually removed, and the security supervisor apologized, but the damage was done. The sign had been placed by someone with access and authority, or the appearance of both. And it had worked. Even after it was gone, people treated the space as ambiguous, as contested. Julie found herself returning from errands to find it occupied again, this time by unfamiliar cars, always left just long enough to inconvenience, never long enough to sight. She stopped trusting the space. Instead, she parked 2 blocks away and walked the distance slowly, deliberately, carrying a folder in her bag that contained copies of every form, every letter, every note. She walked past the building's entrance, past the bulletin board, past the signatures, and past the faces that refused to meet her eyes. She didn't speak. She didn't explain. She simply moved. Until the morning when she found the smear. It was on her windshield, a thick, greasy smear of black paint, slashed diagonally across the glass in a single angry motion. No words. No symbols. Just a mark, crude and final. She stared at it for a full minute before moving, her breathing shallow but controlled. She didn't touch it. She didn't wipe it away. She called Elena. Then she called the police. This time the response was different. The officer who arrived was young but attentive. He listened, he took photos, he noted the ongoing record of conflict. He even asked if she had surveillance footage. She didn't. The building's exterior cameras didn't cover the side street where she had been forced to park. He filed a report anyway and gave her the case number. Elena called later that evening with a quiet edge to her voice. "We're filing?" she said. "No more warnings. No more waiting. This isn't about property anymore. It's targeted interference. And we're naming her directly." Julie didn't argue. She signed the papers the next morning, her hands steady, her breath calm. She sent them off with certified tracking. She logged the submission. She saved the receipt. That night, someone slipped another note under her door. No envelope this time. No ambiguity. Just a single printed phrase in large block letters. You were never entitled to it. Julie stared at it. Then she opened her folder, added it to the file, and turned off the lights. The building was quiet, but the war had changed. Now it was on record. Mentioned $100. The day of the court hearing arrived not with drama, but with a strange sense of stillness that unnerved Julie more than chaos ever could. She woke before sunrise without the aid of an alarm, her body alert in a way that felt unnatural, as if it had been anticipating this for weeks, coiled and waiting for the moment it could finally exhale. Outside, the sky was dull and colorless, the kind of muted gray that made time feel slow, and her apartment felt unnaturally quiet, as if even the walls were holding their breath. She dressed with deliberate care not to impress, but to signal control. Dark colors, low heels, nothing dramatic. A black folder rested in her bag, thick with documentation, dates, letters, and photos. It had weight to it, and she liked that. Tangible weight always outlived speculation. The courthouse itself was small, an administrative building attached to a broader civic center, more accustomed to zoning disputes and property assessments than accusations of civil interference and targeted harassment. Elena met her on the front steps, calm and composed, her briefcase in one hand and a thermos in the other. "We're not here to win," she said without preamble. "We're here to establish. Let them underestimate. Let them pivot. That's their mistake." Julie nodded. She already understood. She wasn't here for punishment. She was here for definition. Something had to be drawn in ink, in records, in public language, not just what had been done, but what it meant. Karen arrived 10 minutes late. She walked in flanked by a man in a tailored jacket and a woman with a tablet clutched against her chest. Her lawyer, and perhaps someone from the gallery or a consultant. She looked thinner than before, more brittle around the edges, though her expression was calm, a composed surface trained to weather scrutiny. Her eyes met Julie's for a brief second, but there was no recognition in the glance, no acknowledgement. It was as if they were strangers, as if none of it had happened, and Julie was simply an inconvenience to be scheduled and resolved. The hearing room was plain, no gallery seating, just a row of tables, a judge, a clerk, and silence. No cameras, no audience, no spectacle. The proceedings were clinical but thorough. Elena presented first, moving through the timeline with practiced precision. She referenced dates without glancing down, cited municipal code, described the legal status of disability signage as protected municipal property. She introduced the cease and desist letter, the fabricated cancellation request, the tracker log, the photographic evidence of the installation, and the print materials from Karen's exhibitions. Each item was handed to the clerk with methodical calm, building the structure brick by brick, not with accusation, but with certainty. Karen's attorney responded in the expected tone, measured, performative, pivoting the conversation away from action and toward interpretation. He used words like misunderstanding, creative expression, and unintended impact. He implied that Karen had been unaware of the origin of the sign, that it had been delivered to her via community donation, that she had believed it was decommissioned, that any implication of harm was coincidental and not malicious. He spoke of her contributions to the community, her long-standing presence in the building, and the challenging climate for artists navigating public space. The argument wasn't that it hadn't happened. It was that it hadn't happened with intent. Julie watched it all in silence, her hands folded in her lap, her posture steady. She didn't interrupt. She didn't react. The power of clarity was in restraint. She knew that by the time the documents spoke, words would feel hollow. When the judge finally addressed her directly, it wasn't with questions about the artwork or the meaning behind the piece. It was about process. Ms. Reed, are you currently receiving any further interference with your parking designation or access to the building? Julie answered simply yes. The space is no longer marked. My sign has not been returned. I was asked to re-verify my disability status after a petition was circulated. The judge nodded once, then looked down at the stack of materials submitted. There was no outrage, no raised voice, just the sound of flipping pages and the soft tapping of keys from the clerk's computer. By the end, no ruling was delivered in the room. This wasn't that kind of hearing. It would be reviewed, summarized, filed. The city would decide whether the actions fell under the jurisdiction of civil interference or required escalation. Elena was satisfied. The record exists now, she said. That's the line they can't erase. As they left, Karen stood by the building's exit, her lawyer murmuring something into her ear, the consultant nodding in rhythm. For a brief moment, Julie hesitated, not out of uncertainty, but out of decision. She walked past them without speaking, but at the door she paused and glanced back, just once. Karen's eyes flicked up, met hers, and in that second, something changed, not the surface, not the practiced calm, but something deeper. A flinch, a crack, the recognition that something had finally been taken from her too. Not reputation, not freedom, but control. That was enough for now. Julie hadn't expected the letter. It arrived 2 weeks after the hearing, printed on thick stock and tucked into an envelope with a gold-embossed return address from the property management office. There was no ceremony, no courier, no warning, just the weight of it, resting inside her mailbox like a quiet conclusion waiting to be read. She took it upstairs, placed it carefully on her kitchen table, and opened it with the same slow patience that had become second nature over the last several months. Inside was a formal notice of reinstatement confirmation that her designated accessible parking space had been reapproved with immediate effect. A new sign had already been ordered, this time with an internal tag and verification number directly registered with the city's Department of Accessibility Services. The letter included an apology not personal but procedural. We acknowledge the previous removal was conducted in error and without appropriate verification. Measures have been implemented to prevent such oversights in the future. Julie folded the letter and set it aside. She didn't smile. She didn't exhale in relief. She simply nodded to herself, the gesture small but certain. This wasn't a victory in the way people like to imagine wins, no confetti, no applause, no grand confrontation where the wrongdoer is forced to grovel, but it was, in every meaningful way, an end, a final line drawn. The structure that had once tried to wash her away had been forced to acknowledge her presence, her permanence, and her right to space. 3 days later, the sign was installed. It wasn't the same model as before. This one was heavier, bolted deeper into the concrete, with a metallic sheen and laser-engraved markings that wouldn't fade under sunlight or snow. Julie stood beside it for a moment after the crew left, her fingers brushing along the edge of the post. There was no sentimentality in her expression, just a quiet recognition of what it represented, not access, not accommodation, but certainty. Something undeniable. Something real. The building changed after that. Not drastically. Not with sudden apologies or new friendships, but with a subtle shift in tone, a quietness where once there had been murmured judgments and glances. The petition was removed from the bulletin board. The laminated flyers never returned. The neighbor who used to nod and look away now said good morning with a certain stiffness, as if unsure whether forgiveness was required or merely distance. Julie didn't offer either. She didn't have to. Karen left the building. The announcement came via a single-sentence email from the board. We have received notice that resident Karen Langford of Unit 3 will be terminating her lease at the end of the month. No reasons listed. No explanation needed. Rumors moved through the building as they always did, soft, eager, and half-informed. Some said it was embarrassment. Others suggested legal pressure from the gallery circuit, especially after a quiet retraction appeared on one of their event pages, noting that several submissions have been withdrawn due to questions regarding material sourcing. One neighbor claimed Karen had been blacklisted from 3 regional programs. Another said she was moving to the coast to reset. Julie didn't listen. She didn't speculate. The only truth she needed was silence and absence. When moving day arrived, she watched from her window. A rental truck parked in the turnaround, and 2 men in black gloves loaded cleanly labeled boxes into the back. No art crates. No assistance. Karen emerged only once, wearing oversized sunglasses despite the cloudy sky. She moved quickly, said nothing to the neighbors who passed, and didn't so much as glance toward Julie's unit. When the truck pulled away, it didn't linger. Julie didn't wave. She didn't gloat. She didn't speak of it later, not even to Elena. Life moved forward in small, concrete ways. She returned to physical therapy once a week. The walk from her car to the building became easier. She began using the cane less indoors, more for balance than necessity. She updated her records, replaced the tracker on the new sign not out of paranoia but habit. She left the folder in the drawer still intact, but no longer active. She didn't revisit the court transcripts. She didn't reread the emails. She let them sit in digital silence. One afternoon, the woman from the front desk, Dawn, caught her in the hallway and handed her a manila envelope. "Someone dropped this off for you." No name. Inside was a small print, wrapped in tissue. Not gallery grade, not expensive, just a glossy photo of a sculpture made from twisted copper wire and a torn road cone. Tucked into the corner of the frame was a post-it note with 2 words, no more. There was no signature, but Julie recognized the handwriting. She didn't keep it. She didn't destroy it either. She left it on the community donation table in the laundry room, leaned neatly against a stack of worn puzzle books and a chipped teacup. By the next morning, it was gone. In the weeks that followed, something unexpected happened. Julie found herself returning to the space she had once retreated from. Not the exhibit halls or city offices, but the courtyard, the side benches, the shared garden she had avoided since the conflict began. She walked slower there, not because of pain, but because she could. She nodded at the man from 1C who always wore headphones and started bringing his dog to the yard again. She answered a question about city permit fees from a younger resident who had recently moved in and wanted to install a satellite dish. She said yes when someone asked if she could share contact info for her lawyer. She didn't become a symbol. She didn't become a spokesperson. She became what she had always wanted to be in that space, undeniably present. One evening, as she pulled into her parking spot and turned off the engine, she sat in silence for a few seconds before opening the door. The sign stood tall beside her, unbothered, untouched. The wind moved through the trees with a soft hiss, and for the first time in months, the building felt still in a way that wasn't loaded with anticipation or threat. Just still. She stepped out, locked the car, and walked toward the lobby. No hesitation. No second glances. The pavement under her shoes was solid. The light above her door flickered once, then held steady. Her key turned without resistance. Inside, her apartment smelled like lavender and wood polish. The window was open just enough to let in the evening air. Her plants were thriving. The calendar on the wall had no circled dates. No countdowns, no hearings, no notices, just the present. And that, finally, was enough.